Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 9 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average have been allowing the most fantasy points to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 9. After which, I'll go ahead and talk about my top 36 ranked running backs, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify those rankings. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Rankings are always subject to change. Between now and Sunday, there's absolutely going to be injury information regarding these running backs, or perhaps even their offensive lines, the defenders that they're going to play up against. All those variables could end up changing the overall ranking of each individual player. So, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. Another way to go ahead and stay up to date on my latest rankings is also going down to the description and checking out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match, be able to go ahead and draft teams, play the pick'ems game via Underdog Fantasy, but you're going to get sent my rankings from me directly to your email every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, half PPR, full PPR, flex rankings, all-encompassing rankings, so regardless of what you're doing on Sunday mornings, you have an advantage upon your league mates. Be sure to take advantage of the opportunity. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible, check out the map to the right side of the screen. Of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. And if you sign up before Thursday's game between the Pittsburgh Steelers and Tennessee Titans, you could take advantage of the new customer special of 0.5 total yards from Kenny Pickett. If in fact he does not play by Thursday, which the expectation is that he will play despite the fact that he's dealing with a rib injury, if in fact he does not play, it'll be changed to a different player, probably Will Levis or something of that extent. So no worries at all. Be sure to check that out. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about the running back position going into Week 9, beginning with matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, the Carolina Panthers are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of running back rushing statistics isolated. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. The reason why I go ahead and isolate running back rushing statistics alone primarily has to do with the fact that receiving statistics aren't really elevated due to a matchup. It's rather the offensive coordinator and quarterback's tendencies to get the running back involved within the receiving game, on top of the capabilities of that running back to be a sufficient option within the receiving game that elevates them within that overall category. Therefore, we isolate rushing statistics. We find that the Carolina Panthers, the Las Vegas Raiders, the Colts, the Giants, these are matchups that we want to take advantage of going into this week. Obviously, I didn't mention the Broncos there because the Broncos, Lions, 49ers, and Jaguars are all on bye going into this week. Do not expect to see those players in today's episode. But besides the most advantageous matchups going into the given week, we also have some of the more disadvantageous matchups: the Philadelphia Eagles, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Falcons. And now that I'm looking at the bottom of this list, I mean, the 49ers, the Lions, and the Jaguars, again, like I just mentioned, they're on bye, but they're some of the toughest matchups at the running back position in terms of running the ball. Either way, luckily, we'll be able to avoid them this upcoming week, but nonetheless, just wanted to go ahead and refer to these statistics. I'll refer back to them over the course of today's video if, in fact, they're relevant in regards to a player's potential upside. Therefore, we'll go ahead and transition into talking about my top 36 ranked running backs, beginning with our number one. We have Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants. Saquon Barkley on Sunday, after Tyrod Taylor left, just purely became the entire offense. They did not allow the backup quarterback to throw the ball at all, and they gave Saquon Barkley quite literally 36 rushing attempts. It only totaled to 128 rushing yards, but that mainly had to do with the fact that it was pretty easy to determine, okay, they're going to run the ball every single time. Nonetheless, for fantasy purposes, he was still relevant, 14.3 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Now, when I go ahead and look at the other running backs in the history of fantasy football that most recently have been able to run for that high of a potential volume of attempts, we're talking about 2017 was the last time any other running back had more rushing attempts. That was Adrian Peterson with the Arizona Cardinals. Just putting it out there for historic purposes. Otherwise, for the last couple of years, Derrick Henry's been able to total like 33, 34, 35 rushing attempts, pretty commonly, which is kind of crazy. But usually every time he has a big performance like that, there's not really a drop off in those following games. But obviously Derrick Henry is a machine, so it's a little bit different. Nonetheless, the reason why Saquon Barkley is in this conversation is because he takes on the Las Vegas Raiders. Like we all saw last night and the week before, Jahmyr Gibbs, Deontay Foreman, back-to-back weeks, running backs are killing the Las Vegas Raiders. They're allowing 18.04 fantasy points per game. That's the third best matchup at the position, and they're also allowing 4.61 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. Daniel Jones is returning, and with Tyrod Taylor out of the overall picture, that leads to potentially more checkdowns going in the direction of Saquon Barkley, while in comparison with Tyrod Taylor, wasn't really often looking towards Saquon for checkdown city. Moving on to our number two, speaking of checkdown city, Alvin Kamara benefits greatly due to the fact that he is associated with Derek Carr. I mean, since returning from the suspension, Alvin Kamara has had himself 39 total receptions, and he's been able to total 21 plus touches in every single game he has played thus far this season. On top of it, he is getting himself a lot of utilization within the red zone, and even though Taysom Hill had himself 2 rushing touchdowns this last Sunday, we still saw Alvin Kamara within the 10-yard line get 3 rushing attempts, while Taysom Hill had 3 rushing attempts. As long as we're going to see a balance between the two and it's not going to be heavily favored in Taysom Hill's direction, of course, Alvin Kamara is going to continue to be relevant, not only through the air, where we know he's going to be extremely successful for fantasy purposes, but also on the ground. This upcoming week, they do take on the Chicago Bears. The Chicago Bears, not only did they go ahead and they added someone via the trade deadline earlier today, but they also are pretty good in terms of stopping the run. Since week 5, this defense has been incredible. In fact, they have only allowed 62 rushing attempts, 152 rushing yards, 0 rushing touchdowns, and a 2.45 yard per carry average to opposing running backs throughout that span of time. It is a very difficult matchup, but nonetheless, Alvin Kamara is going to be able to get it done on the ground, through the air. Hopefully, even more receptions will be able to total if in fact this team cannot run the ball, which only helps for half and full PPR purposes. Moving on to our number 3, we have Austin Ekeler, another one of these stud running backs that you know you must start. Unfortunately, Austin Ekeler in the running game wasn't as efficient, like I just mentioned, with Alvin Kamara, his upcoming matchup against Chicago. The Chicago Bears run-stop defense played extremely well against the Los Angeles Chargers. That's why Austin Ekeler only had 29 rushing yards on 15 rushing attempts. But what saved his overall week? 8 targets, 7 receptions, 94 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Like I mentioned last week, it was only a matter of time until we saw the reintegration of Austin Ekeler within the receiving game and that he finally found the end zone. Of course, he's a touchdown machine, and even though last week's performance really was saved by his overall, screen pass that took him to the house, going into this upcoming week, it should be a little bit easier. They take on the New York Jets, and even though the New York Jets defense is great, they're really just great in the back end. In terms of stopping the run, they haven't been great this season. They're allowing 101 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs. That's the 8th most amongst all teams in the National Football League. The expectation is that Austin Ekeler on the ground through the air should be a fantastic play once again for week 9. Moving on to our number 4. Speaking of the New York Jets, we have Breece Hall. Breece Hall has been absolutely incredible throughout his entire career, 2020, 2023. When he is playing 50 or more percentage of the offensive snaps. In fact, in those games, he's averaging 19.4 half PPR fantasy points per game. And in all 7 of those games where he has played 50 or more percentage of the offensive snaps, he has scored 10 plus fantasy points in all of them in a half PPR scoring format. In the last 3 weeks, we've not only seen him be able to kind of take over this offense in terms of playing majority of the snaps, getting majority of the rushing attempts, but also being a huge option within the receiving game, which we know he's capable of. In the last 3 games, 17 targets, 14 receptions, 147 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Obviously, a lot of those statistics gathered in Sunday's game against the New York Giants. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 76 receiving yards, and a touchdown. It is nice to see that even when the running game isn't finding success for the New York Jets, they're utilizing Breece Hall in the receiving game and allowing him to be a game changer within that overall position. Now, another stat in regards to the overall receiving work that he is getting over the course of those last 3 games, 17 targets on the amount of routes that he has ran. He is being targeted on 31% of the routes he's running. That's a 31% target rate, which is absolutely incredible. They do take on the Chargers this week. The Chargers are the 18th best matchup at the position, allowing just over 10 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics isolated. With the running work, with the receiving work, Breece Hall is another great play once again. Moving on to our number 5, we have Josh Jacobs. Now, even though Jimmy Garoppolo was an absolute mess, and he's holding down this offense truly with his overall efforts, Josh Jacobs against the Detroit Lions found himself a lot of success. 15 rushing attempts for 61 rushing yards. And when I went ahead and I kind of scaled out all those rushing attempts as a whole, the 15 rushing attempts, 10 of them were for 4 or more yards. He even had a 15-yard rushing attempt that didn't count towards his box score, primarily because he fumbled at the end of the play and it was recovered by Jacoby Myers. Nonetheless, a lot of his overall opportunities for positive yardage, even in a difficult matchup. Therefore, if they continue to lean upon the running game, especially going up against the New York Giants this upcoming week, the Giants are allowing 16.98 fantasy points per game. They're the 5th best matchup, and they're allowing 4.7 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. My expectation is that Josh Jacobs should find himself another successful performance. I mean, we go back to weeks 1 through 3. Josh Jacobs was averaging 8.33 fantasy points per game. We look at weeks 4 through 8, he's been averaging 14.4 fantasy points per game. He's slowly but surely getting back on track, finding himself in the end zone. And if Jimmy Garoppolo could just be 25% better, maybe 15% better than he was on Monday night, Josh Jacobs would find even more upside within a given week. Moving on to our number 6, we have DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift takes on the Dallas Cowboys this upcoming week. They're not the best overall matchup, but we have seen teams succeed against them. I mean, even Darrell Henderson and, of course, Royce Freeman, each of them scored over 10 fantasy points. So there is a lot of potential for DeAndre Swift to be of value going into the given week. Absolutely. Especially with the opportunities that he is being given. Thus far this season, from weeks 2 through 8, he has gotten himself a base minimum of 18 opportunities per game. That's workhorse level opportunity. And as long as you're associated with the Philadelphia Eagles offensive line, and they're going to continue to get opportunities down in the red zone, of course, DeAndre Swift is going to be of value. Thus far this season, in the last 7 games, again, not only is he averaging 15.11 fantasy points per game, he has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 7 games. If those numbers continue to climb in terms of touchdowns scored, of course, the upside of DeAndre Swift, especially against the Cowboys this week, should be fantastic. Moving on to our number 7, we have Derrick Henry. He plays on a short week, taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers on Thursday Night Football. But let's go ahead and let's just talk about Derrick Henry's season overall and why we're trending in the right direction. Obviously, we were waiting as to whether or not he'd be traded today. It was relatively unlikely that that was going to be the case, especially considering this team found themselves a huge victory on Sunday and hopefully can take that momentum for the remainder of the season with a new quarterback. He's coming off a performance of 101 rushing yards on 22 attempts, was able to get himself a lot of utilization within the receiving game, a lot of checkdowns from Will Levis, 4 receptions on 4 targets for 21 receiving yards. Those opportunities are going to rack up over the course of the season. But outside of week 3's anomaly of 20 rushing yards and 2 fantasy points from Derrick Henry, in every other game, when you take his averages, he's averaging 21 opportunities per game, 20.7 touches per game, and 15.66 fantasy points per game. Derrick Henry has been a fantastic running back for fantasy purposes, and even though many were thinking that Derrick Henry was falling off this season, yes, he's not as efficient as he was in seasons prior. He doesn't have that huge burst of 80-yard rushing attempts, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that could exist going forward within this offense. They take on the Steelers, which is one of the better matchups, in fact, the 8th best matchup at the position, as they're nearly allowing 15 fantasy points per game. They're allowing 4.44 yards per attempt, and most recently, running backs against this team, Jacksonville, 96 rushing yards from their running backs. LA Rams, 127 and a touchdown. Baltimore, 80 and a touchdown. And even the Houston Texans ran for 110 rushing yards against the Pittsburgh Steelers, despite how inefficient those running backs have been thus far this season. Either way, I'm expecting Derrick Henry to be a fantastic play on Thursday night against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Moving on to our number 8, we have Isiah Pacheco. Isiah Pacheco had himself a little bit of an anomaly of a week. 8 total rushing attempts for 40 rushing yards. On top of the fact that he had -3 receiving yards on 3 receptions. It's kind of a bogus week. I'm just going to kind of throw it out the window because outside of that overall performance, the weeks prior have been incredible for Isiah Pacheco. He's been extremely consistent. In fact, in the prior 5 games, had a base minimum of 17 touches per game. And despite the fact that this last weekend's game against the Denver Broncos, we were expecting snow. They had cleaned it up prior to the game starting and it was ready to go. Even with the game being 9-14 and the Kansas City Chiefs losing at halftime, 9-14 was the score. They came out in the second half, and Isiah Pacheco had 1 rushing attempt in the second half. I'm sure that Andy Reid is going to recalibrate. They're going to Germany to play against the Miami Dolphins. It is an advantageous matchup. In fact, the 10th best matchup at the position, as they're allowing 4.11 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. The expectation is that they're going to get back to the running game. And of course, Isiah Pacheco is going to impose his will on that defense. Moving on to our number 9, we have Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon finally found the end zone. We talked about it last week. He had far too many rushing attempts in the red zone this season to not eventually find the end zone. And considering the fact that the San Francisco 49ers cannot stop a soul defensively, of course, this team coming off the bye, Joe Burrow healthy, and Joe Mixon obviously looking incredible, 16 attempts for 87 rushing yards. They begin to find themselves a lot of success. Now, when we go ahead and look at the next-gen stats chart of his overall rushing attempts on Sunday, yes, he had a couple big runs, but ultimately, it was just a matter of consistency. Not a lot of negative runs in comparison to prior weeks in which, of course, this offensive line is not able to, really stop the penetration into this backfield. Luckily, the offensive line is playing better, and so is Joe Burrow. But for the case of Joe Burrow, he did have himself 2 passing touchdowns inside the 10-yard line. Those 2 touchdowns could have went towards Joe Mixon. He could have had himself a couple rushing attempts there and found himself in the end zone. It is unfortunate, but it is the nature of the beast within that offense. Nonetheless, they take on the Buffalo Bills this week. In the 2022/2023 NFL playoffs, second round of the playoffs, we saw the Cincinnati Bengals take on the Buffalo Bills. In that game, Joe Mixon had 105 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 2 receptions, 18 receiving yards, and 19.3 fantasy points in Buffalo in the snow. He absolutely dominated within the matchup. The Buffalo Bills are allowing 4.81 yards per carry on average. They're the 11th best matchup. They cannot stop the run. The expectation is that Joe Mixon should have himself a huge game here in week 9. Moving on to our number 10, we have Jonathan Taylor. Now, the issue that I have with Jonathan Taylor is that I'm worried that he may have gotten injured in that game. Now, we're going to have to wait until the Wednesday practice report to get more information regarding this. But in the first half, Jonathan Taylor, 11 rushing attempts for 94 rushing yards. In the second half, 1 rushing attempt for 1 rushing yard. In the first half of the game, of course, Zack Moss had himself 7 attempts for 13 rushing yards and a touchdown. In the second half, Zack Moss 5 attempts for 53 rushing yards. The fact that Zack Moss was getting himself implementation within the first half wasn't really a surprise. He was active. But the fact that he out-touched Jonathan Taylor in the second half in terms of rushing attempts, considering how effective Jonathan Taylor was on the ground, is alarming. Late in that second quarter, nearly towards the end, I think about 3 or 2 minutes left within the game, he was rolled up. Jonathan Taylor got up and was kind of gingerly walking around within the backfield. I am worried that he may have kind of re-aggravated an ankle injury. If that's the case, of course, Zack Moss is going to be fired up. Rankings are subject to change. But if, in fact, Jonathan Taylor is healthy, he's taking on the best matchup at the running back position. I mean, the Carolina Panthers allowing 22.1 fantasy points per game on average to opposing running backs, and, of course, allowing over 5 yards per carry. Jonathan Taylor should be a fantastic play if healthy and ready to go. I mean, just looking at his overall rushing chart, the dude could not be stopped, and then they stopped giving him the ball for some reason. Moving on to our number 11, we have Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard's eventually going to score a touchdown. I don't know when it's going to be. I'm going to continue to hope that it's the next following week every time he fails. But this upcoming week, they take on the Philadelphia Eagles. In the last 2 games in which the Dallas Cowboys took on the Philadelphia Eagles last year, the running backs of the Dallas Cowboys in week 6 combined for 24 attempts, 125 and a touchdown, 21.3 fantasy points. And in week 16 against the Philadelphia Eagles, they combined for 25 rushing attempts, 74 yards, a touchdown, 7 catches, 67, 23.6 fantasy points. We have seen the Dallas Cowboys backfield find success against the Philadelphia Eagles last season. They should be looking to re-implement a lot of those overall concepts this upcoming week and dominate against this defense that is vulnerable. I mean, just this last Sunday, we all saw Sam Howell, the Washington Commanders, expose this secondary once again this season. So if Dak Prescott and this offense can take advantage of the overall opportunities there in the secondary, it's only going to open up more opportunities for this offensive line and Tony Pollard. It's just a matter of, can they get him more utilization within the receiving game, and of course give him opportunities down in the red zone to punch it in for 6. I mean, outside of that, it's just a matter of the game script. Truly, this last week against the LA Rams, it was CeeDee Lamb and it was the defense scoring points. And that in itself really did not help Tony Pollard and his overall potential efforts within the given week. Moving on to our number 12, we have Bijan Robinson. I still don't understand why they continue to give the ball to Tyler Algier. Since week 2, Tyler Algier is averaging 2.89 yards per attempt. I mean, just this last week, Bijan Robinson, 11 rushing attempts for 62 rushing yards, finally scored a rushing touchdown in his rookie season. Congratulations. We love to see it, and hopefully that's going to be more of a common thing as they continue. Obviously, he did get himself a little bit of opportunity within the receiving game, 5 total targets, wasn't able to make a singular reception. Now, we're going to have to wait and see whether it's going to be Desmond Ridder or Taylor Heinicke. We know that the offense in the first half with Desmond Ridder only scored 3 points. In the second half with Taylor Heinicke, scored 20 points. There could be a competition there at the quarterback position, especially if, in fact, Desmond Ridder continues to fumble in the red zone, which obviously is hurting a lot of Bijan's potential upside. As long as Desmond Ridder continues to sabotage the team and Arthur Smith continues to sabotage the team by giving the ball to Tyler Algier as much as he does, Bijan Robinson's overall upside is going to be capped. But nonetheless, when he's given the ball, he's extremely efficient and can still be a fantasy relevant back as an RB1. Moving on to our number 13, we have Kenneth Walker. My biggest concern is the fact that Zach Charbonnet outsnapped him 59% to 41%. On first and second downs, it was majority of the opportunities going towards Kenneth Walker in terms of overall snaps, overall touches. But on third down overall opportunities, it was all Charbonnet. On 2-minute drill overall opportunities, it was all Charbonnet. So we're beginning to see a little bit more of a split backfield here. If that's going to be the case, I mean, unfortunately, the overall upside of Kenneth Walker is going to diminish. Even though he's averaging 4.4 yards per attempt this season, Charbonnet's better, far more efficient in that overall category. Even though Kenneth Walker is averaging 89 total yards per game and nearly a touchdown per game thus far this season, 15 fantasy points per game, if in fact this offensive coordinator, this team wants to begin to transition into a two-headed monster backfield, it is going to diminish his overall play. It is a difficult matchup taking on the Baltimore Ravens. For fantasy purposes, we just have to hope that Kenneth Walker can kind of fend off overall opportunities that Charbonnet gets and continue to find majority of the opportunities down in the red zone. Moving on to our number 14, we have Raheem Mostert. This upcoming Sunday, they do take on the Kansas City Chiefs in Germany. Do not forget, on Sunday mornings, when there is a London or Germany game, we start our live live stream at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, so be sure to swing on by for those of you guys who are interested in getting your questions answered, rankings, all that kind of jazz. It's a 4-hour live stream, so typically I do answer a lot of questions, and hopefully I'm able to answer everybody's. But nonetheless, when we talk about Raheem Mostert, his potential going into this week, he's a touchdown monster. We've talked about it. He continues to find himself in the end zone. He continues to lead this backfield in terms of total touches, in terms of total snaps. And as long as that's going to be the case, they take on the Chiefs. They're allowing 4.57 yards per attempt to opposing running backs, over 10 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. The expectation is that Raheem Mostert, with his overall opportunities, yardage on the ground, yardage through the air, a rushing touchdown, that's pretty much a safe play. What he was able to put up last week against the New England Patriots should be a base minimum within the given week. Moving on to our number 15, we have Gus Edwards. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, Gus Edwards has scored 4 rushing touchdowns in just the last 2 games. Obviously, coming off a performance of 19 carries for 80 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, 52% of the overall offensive snaps. I mean, that's ridiculous that he's been able to score 4 touchdowns in 2 games. Typically, we would have at least seen one of those go in the direction of Lamar Jackson, but hey, now we're seeing a Baltimore Ravens running back find relevancy within fantasy. I mean, he was the number 1 overall back last week, and going into this week, we're talking about a running back that amongst all players in the National Football League, he has the 8th most rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. So as long as he's associated with this elite offense, behind a great offensive line who continue to play well, and as long as Lamar Jackson's rushing threat continues to hold a backside defensive end or outside linebacker to be careful of that read option keep, it is going to open up more and more opportunities for Gus Edwards. They take on the Seattle Seahawks this week. The Seahawks are only allowing about 68 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs, only allowing 3.13 yards per attempt to opposing running backs, but quite frankly, it doesn't really matter. This offense has played extremely well against everyone, and even though the Seattle Seahawks are bringing in a guy like Leonard Williams via trade, the expectation is that offensive lines who are elite and know how to run the ball find success. I mean, we just saw that the Cleveland Browns, within their 3 running backs, were able to go for 133 rushing yards and a rushing touchdowns. Elite offensive lines are going to succeed, and I believe the Baltimore Ravens in the running category are absolutely elite. Moving on to our number 16, we have James Cook. The issue with James Cook primarily has to do with the fact that he doesn't score touchdowns. Josh Allen has scored a rushing touchdown in 5 of the last 6 games. Outside of that, James Cook is highly efficient on the ground, highly efficient through the air, probably should get a little bit more receiving upside, but unfortunately doesn't get as many checkdowns because of the mobility of Josh Allen and obviously the new implementation of guys like Dalton Kincaid and Khalil Shakir within the offense, a lot more 11 personnel sets. With that all taken into account, I know that Leonard Fournette was signed to the practice squad. Don't worry about him. He's basically just replacing the overall opportunities of Damien Harris. Obviously, Damien Harris on the injured reserve. The fact of the matter is they take on the Cincinnati Bengals. They're allowing 13.7 fantasy points per game, the 9th best matchup of the position, allowing 4.61 yards per attempt thus far this season. James Cook should find himself success on the ground. As to whether he scores the touchdown, that is the biggest difference maker as to whether or not he's fantasy relevant and a comfortable starting option within the given week. Moving on to our number 17, we have Zack Moss. I wanted to mention Zack Moss just in case my speculations from earlier in regards to Jonathan Taylor come to fruition. Like I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Taylor in the first half, 11 attempts for 94 yards. Second half, 1 attempt for 1 yard. While, of course, Zack Moss in the second half of the game had 5 attempts for 53. If, in fact, Zack Moss is going to continue to steal touchdowns, which he did in the first half of that game, on top of stealing touchdowns, if he is going to be the healthier back, and Jonathan Taylor maybe was dealing with an ankle injury in the second half, and that's why he didn't get himself utilization, then Zack Moss will be even more relevant, and that's why I kind of have him in this number 17 spot with the potential of being higher. But even if Jonathan Taylor is a full go, Zack Moss is still a relevant piece. I mean, he is still getting himself a lot of opportunity within this backfield. Had himself 11 rushing attempts, 66 yards and a touchdown, 1 reception on 1 target. As long as he gets himself 10 plus touches a week, he's going to be relevant behind this offensive line. And as long as he has potential for touchdown upside, taking on the Carolina Panthers, the best matchup at the position, allowing over 5 yards per carry to opposing running backs and over 22 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, Zack Moss, a fantastic play within the given week. Moving on to our number 18, Jerome Ford. Jerome Ford is going to get himself more opportunity as we slowly progress. It's just going to be a matter of whether or not Jerome Ford has the upside of scoring a touchdown. Now, of course, in the last 3 games, we have seen Kareem Hunt score a touchdown at least once per game. And I'm assuming that once, in fact, Jerome Ford is fully healthy and has more, utilization within this offense, only played 33% of the offensive snaps, only had 10 total touches. I mean, just a week prior to Sunday's game, he was in a walking boot because of the ankle injury that he sustained. So if we're going to be in a situation where he's going to once again take command of this backfield, they take on the Arizona Cardinals, the 6th best matchup at the position, allowing 4.46 yards per carry and nearly 17 fantasy points per game. my expectation would be that Jerome Ford within this backfield, even though there is a Kareem Hunt, even though there is a Pierre Strong, would be the lead back. And of course, will continue to find success. And with no Deshaun Watson, the emphasis continues to be running the ball and keeping the ball out of PJ Walker's hands. Moving on to our number 19, we have Rachaad White. Rachaad White has played extremely well in the last 2 weeks for fantasy purposes, but the reason why he's been able to do so hasn't been on the ground, but rather through the air. In the last 2 weeks, 13 targets, 13 receptions, 135 receiving yards. He's had himself at least 2+ receptions every single week since week 2, so we know that he gets himself utilization within the receiving game, but getting yourself 6 receptions or 7 receptions per week and averaging 10 yards per reception within those overall contests is extremely elite. Very few running backs are able to kind of achieve that level of success within the receiving game. And if Rachaad White can continue to do so, and this team will transition away from running the ball inefficiently up the middle and potentially dumping it off to him in open space in order to find themselves those short yardage first and second down plays, it is only going to help the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as an offense going forward. They take on the Texans. It's the 12th best matchup at the position on the ground. But as long as Rachaad White continues to get opportunity through the air, absolutely should be relevant for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 20, we have Chuba Hubbard. It was evident last week when the offensive coordinator and the head coach of the Carolina Panthers did not want to comment on whether or not Chuba Hubbard and or Miles Sanders were going to be the starter. It was obvious that Chuba Hubbard had really made an impression upon the team. And obviously considering Miles Sanders literally only had 2 rushing attempts for 0 yards and 0 fantasy points last week, and Chuba Hubbard had himself 17 total touches, played 67% of the overall snaps, it is evident that Chuba Hubbard is going to be the guy going forward. They do take on the Indianapolis Colts. It's the 4th best matchup at the position, allowing 17.63 fantasy points per game. The expectation is, as long as Chuba Hubbard is the starter of this backfield, in a revenge game for Frank Wright taking on his former team where he used to coach in the Indianapolis Colts, they should be running the ball and continuing to find success on the ground. And of course, potentially through the air, considering we know the capabilities of Chuba Hubbard as a receiving back. Moving on to our number 21, Kareem Hunt. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier with Jerome Ford, Kareem Hunt has been a touchdown monster. 4 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 games, 1 per game minimum. And as long as that continues to rack up, fantastic. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I mean, we're talking about Kareem Hunt, who over the course of the last 3 weeks is only averaging 3.69 yards per carry, hasn't been highly efficient, but is utilized down in the red zone in the absence of Jerome Ford. So as we progress towards Jerome Ford taking over the starting running back job, I mean, you go back a couple weeks, it wasn't long ago where Jerome Ford was breaking off a 50-yard rushing touchdown within this backfield behind this incredible offensive line. But nonetheless, I still believe that Kareem Hunt is going to get value. He's going to get opportunity, and within one of the best matchups of the position against a team like the Arizona Cardinals, who are nearly allowing 17 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics, 4.46 yards per carry, Kareem Hunt should still be of value. Moving on to our number 22, we have Brian Robinson Jr. taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, I didn't expect it to be a shootout as such, but I guess the earlier game between these two teams was a precursor as to what we were going to potentially see. I didn't anticipate that it would be this high scoring from the Washington Commanders, but nonetheless, it was. They take an early lead, and with that, they allowed Brian Robinson to get implemented within the rushing game, 10 attempts for 59 rushing yards, 5.9 yards per carry. Going forward, it's just going to be a matter of what kind of a potential contest we're in. If Sam Howell is throwing the ball for majority of the game, we're going to see less of Brian Robinson. That's a given. We'll see far more Antonio Gibson. I mean, in week 8, they threw the ball 52 times. That's the most that they have thrown the ball within a game this season. But when we look at the games thus far this season, the 4 in which we have seen this offense throw the ball 40 or more times, we're seeing, of course, unfortunately, Brian Robinson Jr. averaged 7.9 fantasy points per game and only averaged 9.5 total attempts per game on the ground. While on the other side of this conversation, in games in which the Washington Commanders and Sam Howell throw the ball less than 40 times per game, in the 4 games in which they've had those overall experiences this season, Brian Robinson Jr. is averaging 14.53 fantasy points per game and 14.25 touches per game in terms of rushing attempts. My expectation between these two teams, the New England Patriots and Washington Commanders, a lower scoring contest, and with that, more opportunities for Brian Robinson to run the ball and find himself in the double-digit conversation at the running back position. Moving on to our number 23, we have Rhamondre Stevenson, the other half of this conversation. On the other side of the matchup, Rhamondre Stevenson takes on the Washington Commanders. That defense just got rid of 2 of their starters, Sweat and Young. So that defensive line is going to be in shambles. But going forward, it's just a matter of, can Rhamondre Stevenson get enough opportunity within this backfield to be an efficient back? Only 2 receptions for 11 yards. Not great, especially when you're in a negative game script for a majority of that game. But without Kendrick Bourne for the remainder of the season, unfortunately, season-ending injury, and of course, Devontae Parker most likely going to miss with a concussion, this should be check down city for Rhamondre Stevenson this upcoming week with Mac Jones. Outside of Demario Douglas, really, it is going to be Rhamondre Stevenson as a primary receiving threat within this overall game. I'm expecting somewhere between 12 to 18 overall touches for him, on the ground through the air combined. So with those overall opportunities, should be a decent option. It's just a matter of whether or not he can find the end zone to whether he's fantasy relevant within the given week. Moving on to our number 24 and number 25, I wanted to go ahead and join both of the Rams running backs together because there is information in regards to Matthew Stafford potentially playing this week. He's day-to-day according to Sean McVay. They do have a bye week in week 10. So my expectation is that we won't see Matthew Stafford play. And if that's going to be the case, both these running backs are going to be asked to do a lot, especially if Brett Rippon is going to be the starting quarterback for the LA Rams. They do take on the Green Bay Packers. It's the 7th best matchup at the position. They're allowing 15.44 fantasy points per game, over 4 yards per carry. So if both these running backs are consistently running the ball, let's say they both run the ball 12 plus times on Sunday, there is an expectation for both of these guys to be fantasy relevant, have the opportunity to be low-end RB2s, but if they find the end zone, can absolutely be relevant, upside players within the high-end RB2 conversation. It's just a matter of, can this offense get back to where they were last season? Back into the season late last year, without Matthew Stafford in the lineup, we saw in the final 5 games of the season, Cam Akers was able to put together a string of games in which he was averaging 15 plus fantasy points per game. If we can find ourselves a lot more success within that capacity, getting these both these running backs implemented within the running game and of course receiving game, of course both of them should be fantastic. If it wasn't for the fact that Royce Freeman yoinked a touchdown on the 1 yard line, that Darrell Henderson literally got tackled on the 1 yard line the play prior, there would not really be much of a conversation here. I mean, Darrell Henderson should be the higher ranked back. I mean, he got himself the receiving utilization. He had more rushing attempts and honestly should have had that rushing touchdown if it wasn't for that 1 yard steal that unfortunately Royce Freeman had within the given week. Moving on to our number 26 and number 27, we have A.J. Dillon and we have Aaron Jones. Like I've mentioned on multiple occasions, the Green Bay Packers are the worst offense in the National Football League in the first half. They're only averaging 4.1 points per game in the first half. If you're going to continue to be in negative game scripts, both these running backs are not going to be able to efficiently run the ball. 6 rushing attempts for A.J. Dillon, 7 for Aaron Jones. On top of it, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon split snaps 51% each. Of course, they're still limiting Aaron Jones because of his hamstring. Both of them were able to get themselves, 4 catches for 17, 5 catches for 41. Overall, neither of these two running backs can be relevant as long as this offense continues to suck in the first half. But at least for fantasy purposes, they'll be catching the ball a lot in the second half. But if the Green Bay Packers continue to trend in the wrong direction, rushing touchdown upside isn't going to be as likely. Rushing, yardage in the second half isn't going to be as likely, which of course, for these two running backs is absolutely needed considering they're both splitting overall snaps. Moving on to our number 28, we have Emari Demercado. The expectation is that Clayton Tune will most likely be the starting quarterback because Kyler is going to be rested for another week. And we just saw Joshua Dobbs get traded to the Minnesota Vikings, luckily. Outside of that, Emari Demercado in the matchup, even though in the last 4 games, Emari Demercado is averaging 4.27 yards per carry, you may be thinking, well, I don't know if I can trust him against the Cleveland Browns considering it's a rookie quarterback. They may stack the box against him and make it difficult. I mean, the Cleveland Browns, they've had themselves 4 interceptions in the last 3 games, forcing a lot of incompletions. In fact, the last 3 quarterbacks that have played against the Cleveland Browns are averaging a 57% passing completion percentage. So it's going to be difficult. But that being said, the Cleveland Browns are still allowing 4.29 yards per carry to opposing running backs thus far this season on average. So Emari Demercado could be a value. The only issue I have is the quarterback play and then potentially stacking the box against a running back as such. Moving on to our number 29. Now, speaking of the Minnesota Vikings and the trade that they made earlier today, they brought in Joshua Dobbs, luckily. It is only going to elevate all of the receiving threats of this offense in comparison to what Jaren Hall was going to be able to obviously accomplish. Now, we're expecting that Jaren Hall will probably be the starting quarterback this week, and they'll probably lean upon the running game a little bit more. But once, in fact, Justin Jefferson is back, once, in fact, Joshua Dobbs is the starting quarterback of this team going forward, all the receiving threats, Hawkinson, Addison, Jefferson, they have a huge upgrade in comparison to what they would have been with Jaren Hall. Obviously, still a downgrade from Kirk Cousins, but nonetheless, we'll take it. Going up against the 4th most difficult matchup of the position, Alexander Mattison will be in trouble. He did have himself 16 rushing attempts. He is still the starting running back of this team, but it is not going to be an easy matchup within the given week, despite some of the injuries the Atlanta Falcons defensive line has sustained as of late. Moving on to our number 30, we have Dameon Pierce. Even with Dameon Pierce being highly inefficient, if it wasn't for the fact that quite literally he had one of those touchdowns called back because they said he was down prior to breaking the play, and in the following play, he had himself the fullback punch it in and steal the touchdown. If it wasn't for those mishaps and in a couple of the offensive line, mishaps of not being able to open up a couple holes down on the goal line, I mean, Dameon Pierce could have very easily had himself 2 touchdowns and could have very easily been a fantasy relevant back within last week's performance against the Carolina Panthers. I mean, that was really the expectation. Unfortunately, it didn't come to fruition. They do take on the Buccaneers, who are allowing over 4 yards per carry on average. And as long as Dameon Pierce has the opportunity of scoring a touchdown within the red zone, he'll still continue to be a kind of RB3 potential starting option with his overall opportunity. Moving on to our number 31, Najee Harris. And you know what? Let's just bring up number 32 as well, Jaylen Warren. Both these running backs are going to be in a committee situation for the remainder of the season. Both of them are going to be utilized on the ground, through the air. Both of them are going to score touchdowns. Both of them are going to split overall snaps. It's just a matter of who's going to have the higher overall upside. They do take on the Tennessee Titans. The Titans are allowing 3.99 yards per attempt to opposing running backs, nearly 12 fantasy points per game, the 14th best matchup at the position. The expectation is that both these guys will probably be like 5 to 8, 9 fantasy points this week, with the hopes of maybe scoring a touchdown and having more upside. But outside of that, we're not really expecting much between the two. Moving on to our number 33, we have Jeff Wilson Jr. Jeff Wilson Jr., I'm expecting is going to get more touches as we progress until the return of Devon Achane. Once Achane returns, Jeff Wilson will cease to exist within this backfield. But as of right now, the next best option outside of Raheem Mostert is going to continue to be Jeff Wilson Jr. They do prefer him in the receiving game, so if that's going to be an opportunity for him within the matchup against Kansas City in Germany, hopefully there'll be an increased potential for touchdown upside within the given week. Moving on to our number 34, we have Zach Charbonnet. Zach Charbonnet out snapping and nearly out touching and getting all of the 3rd down and 2-minute drill work within the offense is a clear indication that they are potentially going to pivot in his direction. Time will tell. I want multiple weeks of evidence as to, whether or not Zach Charbonnet is going to be relevant within this backfield and get himself a consistent volume of touches and snaps. And if in fact that's going to be the case, going forward we'll be ranked higher. But as of right now, we're just going to be cautious with it and take the information very slowly and not overreact to some of the overall news that we've heard and seen as of week 8 going into week 9. Moving on to our number 35, we have D'Onta Foreman. D'Onta Foreman, Roschon Johnson, Darrynton Evans, a complete running back by committee situation. Darrynton Evans stole a touchdown. Roschon Johnson's the preferred receiving back. And going forward, until this offense is in a positive game script and able to run the ball consistently in the second half, D'Onta Foreman seems like he's potentially a droppable option, considering we are just around the corner from Khalil Herbert returning to this lineup and potentially joining another member within this overall committee situation, which is an absolute mess. Moving on to our number 36, we have Tyjae Spears, the final member I wanted to mention, primarily because in a short week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, it could be tough for Derrick Henry to go from a game in which he had 26 total touches to a game in which he's going to potentially have to recreate something very similar within 5 days. My expectation would be that we may see a little bit more Tyjae Spears. I mean, he played 44% of the offensive snaps on Sunday, so if we see more overall touches go in his direction, I wouldn't be surprised, which absolutely can make him fantasy relevant as a top 36 option. Okay, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed today's content, subscribe, click the like button down below. If you guys want to stay up to date on my latest rankings, you can either check out Patreon, link down in the description. Go ahead and check out the monthly subscription there, or go ahead and check out Underdog Fantasy. All you got to do is make a first-time deposit minimum of $10 using code Andrew, and you'll get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. Check that out. Take advantage of the opportunity. Until tomorrow, which we'll be talking about the wide receiver position. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.